Nobody wants to find themselves in the middle of a PR crisis. And no PR pro wants to be reacting like a stunned boxer or a mixed martial arts fighter as blow after blow lands on them before they get their feet set and properly assess how to get ahead. In this session, we're going to learn how to be ready for that crisis fight long before the first blow lands by focusing on your most valuable weapon, your organization's capital S story. So what are we going to discuss today? Here's a roadmap. We're going to establish a foundation first, determine some common terminology, and then we'll investigate how stories are at the heart of all crisis communication and how to make sure your story is shared in the midst of a crisis. Ultimately, we want to learn how our organizations can become heroes rather than villains in a crisis. And finally, we're going to develop a new crisis plan or give you the tools to do so based on heroic storytelling. So before we begin, why listen to me? Why attend this session? Well, because at our firm, in a given year, we handle 12 major crises, 2 of which are all over the news and 10 you never hear about. In fact, at our firm, we often joke that we're in an industry obsessed with awards, that there ought to be an award for the best headline you never read. Unfortunately, what you see on the screen here, it's a crisis that generated a lot of headlines. A few years ago, in our home city of Pittsburgh, we had a major bridge project crossing one of the major rivers downtown. And a client was working on the bridge and the bridge caught on fire. Yes, note to self in the era of social media, do not have a crisis that can be seen from every downtown building in your city and posted live to social media. So that's what happened here. In the 21st century, you can't hide from crises like these. And this video, in fact, was first posted on social media. All right. So to get started, let's do a refresher on crisis communications. I'm going to give you some definitions that we use at our firm. They may be a little bit different than some of the ones you're used to. I do hope they're useful. Okay. First and foremost, crisis PR is the brain surgery of PR. Now, I'm not, patting myself on the back or patting anybody who does crisis communications on the back. What we're doing is we're reflecting the very real dangers that are inherent in crisis PR. Because, if you do this wrong, it can kill your organization. It's high stakes. And not only that, but compared to any other flavor of PR, the usual measures just don't apply. If you're a PR pro, most of the time you're trying to get more coverage for your issue or your product or your service. That's exactly what you don't want with crisis PR. And you have the least control over a crisis story. And then, of course, as I suggested earlier, because of social media, things can get really rough out there. Now, let's keep things simple here. There are really only 4 kinds of a crisis. Now, you may have been taught and you may believe that there are more than that. For the purposes of our session, our time together, let's just keep it simple. Not surprisingly, let's call them acts of God, acts of nature, if you will. A hurricane would be a great example. Then, of course, there are crises that are an act of man, a fire, and some other sort of a disaster, maybe a corporate scandal or something like that. And then, of course, there are acts of God made worse by man. So a few years ago in Texas, during all the hurricanes and flooding, there was a situation where there was a chemical plant where they were making chemicals that if they came in contact with water, they would explode. Guess what happened when the plant flooded? So that's an example of a crisis in which it was man-made, making something that was natural even worse. And then, of course, there are acts of man made worse by God. And go back a few years to the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And you can see we're an oil spill, and then there's weather, made it even worse. So those are the 4 kinds of crises that we're going to focus our attention on today. Now, here's the good news. University research over decades has shown that 95% of crises are predictable. Unfortunately, federal government statistics from the SBA and other sources show that 40% of all companies will not survive a disaster. Can you see the disconnect there? I mean, think about BP for a very quick moment. If you're going to drill for oil 10,000 feet below the surface of the Gulf of Mexico, what's a likely thing that could happen? A pipe could break, right? Unfortunately, not enough businesses consider this stuff in advance. So, I mean, this is why what's known as sunny day crisis planning becomes so important. Here on the right, you see some examples of a crisis plan we've done for a client. When should you be preparing for the hurricane? You should be doing that before the hurricane hits. That's sunny day crisis planning. And it's not only the crisis plan itself, it's a crisis communication plan. The two are interrelated, but they are indeed different. In our work, most often what we see is that organizations might have a very beefy operational plan for a crisis, but they really haven't considered the communications at all. You have to have a crisis team and a spokesperson. This is critically important. And finally, you got to practice. In this regard, my adaptation of drill, baby, drill does not really apply to the way you would think of it in the classic sense, which of course is as drilling an oil well, but you have to practice. Now, what's missing from all of this stuff? Well, it's a term that we at our firm call your capital S story. And as great as all these best practices are, and if you've been doing crisis communications for a while, a lot of what I've shared already, you probably heard or seen before. That's not the point. The point is to lay a foundation for talking about storytelling in a crisis. And what we see at our firm is there's a specific kind of a story that's most often missing in crisis communications. We call it the capital S story. It's the subject of my new book, Finding Your Capital S Story, Why Your Story Drives Your Brand. Now, as we do our work, your capital S story has many uses. It's most important in a crisis because that's when your organization's mettle is most tested. Your ability to communicate what people believe to be the authentic story of your organization. It's your most important marketing asset. The capital S story is the story that answers the question, why would somebody buy from you, work for you, invest in you, partner for you, or partner with you? So those are the factors that a good capital S story answers. And if you think about a crisis, never are they more challenged than in that kind of situation. All right. We just talked about that. So let's talk about storytelling in crisis. There's a unique need for storytelling in a crisis in several different ways. Before a crisis, during the crisis, and after the crisis. And frankly, at our firm, the before the crisis and after the crisis are the two time periods when we see, unfortunately, not enough focus on storytelling. In the heat of the moment, organizations that haven't prepared to share their story will get everything together. And unfortunately, it often comes off looking somewhat inauthentic because the story hasn't been shared before. And when the crisis is over, it can seem inauthentic if that story isn't being shared again. Bad things do happen to good organizations. But after the crisis, if you don't remind people that that's the case, they will not think well of you. They will be more predisposed to think ill of you. That's the 21st century environment in which we live in. All right, so let's take a look at a timeline of storytelling during a crisis. It's valid since that's when the heat's on. That's when things are at their worst. At our firm, we break down this storytelling into 3 phases. The first one we call stop bleeding. Even if you're not a fan of TV medical disaster shows, certainly you're aware of them. Grey's Anatomy, everything from Shondaland. Everybody seems to work in the emergency room. What's the first thing that happens? Stabilize the patient. It's no different in crisis communications. But once you do that, the next thing you have to do is win hearts and minds. Again, something bad happens to a good organization, the organization responds, then it needs to remind everybody who cares about that organization why it's going to be okay. Yes, you can still trust us. Here's what happened, et cetera, et cetera. And the third phase we call restore reputation. So if you think of a huge disaster like the BP oil spill, you had to get the fire out. Sadly, in that case, it's 10 years ago now, but 11 people lost their lives. They got to get things under control. And then you have to remind everybody, yes, we are prepared as an organization to deal with the cleanup. We can handle this situation. And then when you move into the third phase, that's where the long, slow work really goes on. And so 10 years after the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, they are still spending significant amounts of money to take care of the situation that happened there to help restore communities. So frequently, stop the bleeding can be, the first 24 hours or maybe week. Winning hearts and minds can be even 3 to 6 months after the initial crisis. And restoring the reputation can take years, if not decades. Okay, so this concept of the capital S story, how does that help you in a crisis? Well, first of all, especially for those of you who are experienced crisis communicators, everything in a crisis is compressed by time. You don't have time to go through a long story. So if you haven't shared with your important stakeholders your authentic story, you're really not going to have time to do that in the middle of a crisis. And as I said earlier, it can come off as somewhat inauthentic. A great capital S story has what we call synaptic shortcuts. I'll give you an example. It doesn't have to do with crisis, but it's easily understood. You do not have to be a biblical scholar to know that if a company is a David and Goliath story, they are the underdog who's taking on the giant. That's just one example of many synaptic shortcut storylines that we develop in our work with our clients. But if the public you're trying to reach, the stakeholders you're trying to reach, know who you are before a crisis happens, they have some way of sorting through in this compressed time period how you're going to respond to it. Critically important. And then finally, let's get real. We've got an entire summit here talking about crisis. What do you and most of your colleagues who are participating in these sessions want in a crisis? You want to share your story, not the story that the media or trolls on social media are telling. So this is your story. That's why the capital S story is so important. All right. So the capital S story, as I said, is a very broad concept that can be applied in many non-crisis situations. But how do you use it in a crisis? First, understand your industry's heroes. Now, think for a minute, when a crisis happens to a competitor organization, one of the first things that happens is the stakeholders, including the media, say to themselves, well, I wonder what everybody else is doing. So let's take the nursing home industry as an example in COVID. Now, we have clients in the nursing home industry. There might be an operation that has some unfortunate, bad, experience with deaths and infections. Reporters are going to say, well, that's this institution. What about others? So you need to know who the heroes are, and also you need to know who the villains are. Right? And again, crises are more than 90% predictable. So, okay, maybe we didn't foresee that COVID-19 was going to happen in the last year or two, but something we could have done as an institution like a nursing home, knowing that flu and many other viruses are infecting, we could have prepared for a mass infection event. We could have thought about how we want to be a hero rather than a villain. And we could think about when a crisis happens, what sorts of villains there are in the industry and make sure we are not them, and develop a plan to share your story so you can ride the coattails of the heroes and not get stuck with the victims. All right. So these are broad concepts. Let me bring it down a step so that you can see a little bit more closely how you might use this. Now, the concept of a capital S story has its roots in psychology, in mythology, and yes, indeed, PR and marketing. What you see here is our firm's take on the 12 most common archetypes found in literature and found in business. So as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen here, if you can see my cursor, you've got the hero, the magician, the sage, you've got the outlaw over here. So an example of the outlaw in business would be Southwest Airlines. That's part of their authentic story. The way they do things is not the way other airlines do them. That's part of their story and part of who they are. If you think about the use of the outlaw in literature or pop culture, Luke Skywalker in the Star Wars films would be an example of an outlaw. Okay, so that's how those things work in a general sense. When a crisis happens, and certainly there have been issues around all three of these industries, these are different kinds of heroes. It's worth thinking in advance of a crisis, the same way you would about your operational plan, about who the heroes are in your industry and how you're going to align your story with heroic storylines versus getting wrapped into a villainous storyline. One of the handouts you're going to get for participating in this session is what we call our hero worksheet. And that's just what this is on the slide here. I've given you some examples and the opportunity to work through yourself and figure out who your heroic story might be. Now, let's talk about villains. In our general work with clients in creating capital S story paradigms for them through our trademark process called story crafting, we are rarely talking about villains. But in a crisis scenario, you have to talk about the villains. And understanding them, identifying them is critical to success in crisis communications. So let's walk through this example here from Remus Shepard. Full credit to him. I think this is fascinating and a worthwhile exercise for crisis communicators and teams to go through. This is sort of what happens with a villain in a story. So first of all, the villain believes themselves to be a master, maybe the master of all, and then they're missing something. So, in a crisis situation and media coverage, it's like, it's not good enough that the company was in the top of their market. Somebody had to steal money or something, right? That would be one example. And then, of course, no, we're not stealing. There's no problem here. In terms of the way we define our ethics, we're doing just fine. And then something happens. Maybe the government comes after them, or there's a public interest group who's very concerned about the situation. And so there's this battle that goes on, right? And then in the story with a happy ending, the villainous plans are foiled and the world is delivered from danger, right? And then there just might be some little, here in this example, Shepard calls it a villainous echo. I like that term, regardless of whether or not you think it applies to anybody in the industry that your organization might be in. So again, you're going to get these slides, but this is, I think, a valuable exercise to take your organization through to understand when it comes to problems in your business or your industry, how will you be treated? How have others been treated when there's been other crises in your industry? This can really help you plan your response to a crisis, starting with developing your capital S story. I mean, let's face it, especially in a crisis, villains drive the news more than anybody else, right? And these are just a couple recent ones in the last year or so, 2021. thereabouts that I just pulled to give some examples of the kind of coverage that villains get, right? And we don't want to be villains. Remember what I said at the beginning, wouldn't it be great if our industry had an award for the best headline you never read, right? It's helpful to consider that not every villain is the same, right? So I've just got three here from recent years, and as the summit is underway, United has been in again. I originally had this in the slide because of them hustling people off airplanes, but now we had an airplane over Denver have an engine explode, and so now United is in the news all over again, and Boeing 777s have been grounded. Of course, Equifax had this massive security breach a few years ago, and well, Wells Fargo. I've done a lot of crisis speaking, and I've had three different CEOs in to exemplify Wells Fargo in their presentations, and they keep getting fired or quitting because they keep having crises. Not a good look, right? Okay. So what are the takeaways here for you? Number one, don't be the villain. And you won't be if you remember the universal truths of crises. It's a serious endeavor. You're probably not going to have a chance to do it over. So you got to look at it differently. 40% of companies don't survive a crisis, government statistics. So you want to make sure you're not one of them. So flip the traditional idea of PR on its head, outline the anti-capital S story, the villainous story, understand your likely crisis scenarios, learn from the examples so you can apply your capital S story, your authentic story, to assure that you can ride out a crisis. Now, quick recap. Why does it work? Because crises move too fast for regular PR. Great story archetypes don't require explanation. Remember the synaptic shortcut I talked about earlier? In a crisis, you got to go, go, go. You don't have time to sit there and go through features and benefits and remember this great story that was written about organization here or this TV interview, blah, blah, blah. You need to have something that you can do and say in the moment that resonates and connects. People can see and feel what your authentic story really is. And you're going to be able to move faster and get better results if you're using these synaptic shortcuts. All right. Your next steps, develop your own heroic storytelling plan. What's in that? Number one, again, download. You're going to get the hero worksheet. It'll get you and your colleagues on your team starting to think about what kind of heroic story you have in your organization. Identify the villains too in your industry so you know who you don't want to be like, so that if something bad happens in your industry and it doesn't immediately affect you and maybe you're doing everything right, you don't want to be tarred and feathered like the villains. And then you develop a plan that leverages that capital S story. Plan for the scenarios, remember, 95% of all crises are predictable, that can quickly point back to your heroic story. And whatever you do, make sure you plan to avoid the villainous story. And then drill, baby, drill. Practice, practice, practice. A crisis plan is no good if it sits on the shelf. A story I tell often when I speak about crisis, I got a call from a client one day. He's like, the building's on fire. And I said, oh my God, that's terrible. I'm so sorry to hear that. I said, well, let's open your crisis plan and get to work. And he said, I can't. It's inside the building. Yep. You want to make sure that you're prepared before that happens. Don't leave your crisis plan in the building, I guess, is the moral of that story. All right. At the beginning and throughout, I promised you some free resources. So here you go. Number one, you'll get the Finding Your Organization's Hero worksheet. Number two, a list of the 52 most commonly asked questions in a crisis interview. And number three, access to an excerpt from my book that'll give you a little bit deeper understanding of this concept we're calling the capital S story. All of these are available at this link, wordwritepr.com/agilitypr-crisis. wordwritepr.com/agilitypr-crisis. Now, of course, I'd also love to hear from you. Appreciate you being in the session. viewing it, however, and whatever time you may be viewing it, there's my email address. There's our website. I want to thank you for taking the time to spend some time with me and to learn more about the importance of sharing your story in times of crisis. We really do believe at our firm that your story is your most powerful PR weapon. And I hope you've learned something from this session to help you make sure that you've got that weapon ready to go in the unlikely event that you or your organization find yourself in a crisis.